The early morning sun cast a soft golden hue over the quiet streets of Napa Valley, where dew still clung to the leaves and the air smelled faintly of lavender and fresh soil. A group of tourists, mostly older couples dressed in crisp linen and expensive sunglasses, chatted among themselves near a sleek blue and white tour bus parked outside a boutique countryside inn. Laughter, the rustling of maps, and the distant sound of a barista frothing milk from inside the lobby cafe created a peaceful, almost cinematic atmosphere. Then, almost unnoticed at first, a young woman stepped out from the inn's modest side entrance. She moved with the kind of grace that doesn't draw attention but leaves an impression in hindsight. Her name was Emma Brooks. She couldn't have been older than 27, with dark auburn hair pulled back in a loose, elegant twist. She wore a long, soft gray linen dress that brushed just above her ankles, and simple flats that had clearly seen miles of walking. Over one shoulder hung a faded canvas bag with an embroidered grapevine pattern on the side, and in her hand she carried a travel guide, dog-eared, covered in neat pencil markings and well-worn at the spine. She smiled politely at the group as she approached the tour bus, quietly blending into the scene with the kind of calm that made people instinctively move aside, not out of deference, but out of a strange, unspoken uncertainty. One of the women in the group, well coiffed with oversized pearl earrings and a silk scarf knotted around her neck, eyed Emma's outfit and whispered something to her husband, who gave a short, dry chuckle. Their guide, Jessica, a woman in her early 30s with beach blonde waves, designer sneakers, and the kind of voice that carried even when she didn't mean it to, held a clipboard in her perfectly manicured hands. She was going down the list, reading off names with the efficient authority of someone who had led this exact tour dozens of times. When Emma stepped forward and said, "Emma Brooks," Jessica paused, lifted her eyes slowly, and gave a tight smile that didn't reach them. Sorry, I don't seem to have that name down," she said, tilting her head just slightly in that way people do when they want you to know they don't believe you, even before you speak. Emma, still calm, offered her phone with the booking confirmation open on the screen. Jessica barely glanced at it. "This tour is part of the Golden Trail's premium heritage line," she said, her tone cool and practiced. "It's typically reserved for guests who booked through our partner Concierge Network. You might want to check with the office again. Maybe you were meant to be on the budget route." She chuckled, just barely, then turned back toward the group. Emma remained standing there, still holding the confirmation, her posture serene but clearly not passive. And yet, no one said anything. Not the driver, not the other tourists, not even the elderly man who had watched her arrive with a quiet, thoughtful gaze. The bus door remained open, but the message was clear. Emma was not welcome. Emma didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice, demand to speak to a manager, or push her way past the guide. Instead, she stood still, the sunlight filtering gently through the thin canopy of trees overhead, warming her shoulders and casting soft shadows across the ground. Her expression remained composed, not cold but distant in a way that suggested she had seen this kind of treatment before, and had learned long ago not to waste her energy on confrontation that led nowhere. Slowly she lowered her hand, with the phone still displaying the confirmation email, and tucked it back into her canvas bag. Behind her, the engine of the bus hummed steadily, and the last few tourists began boarding, murmuring to one another in tones meant to be private but loud enough for her to hear. "I mean, did you see her shoes? Completely flat. Not even a heel. She's probably one of those solo hikers who wandered in," one woman said as she adjusted the strap on her straw sun hat. Another man chuckled and added, "Maybe she's a local artist who thought this was some kind of community outing. Looks like she slept in that dress." The laughter wasn't cruel exactly, it was worse. It was effortless, thoughtless, as if mocking someone was as natural as breathing. Jessica had already moved on, pointing to the welcome baskets on the front seats and explaining how each guest would receive a complimentary bottle of estate wine at the final stop. She didn't look back at Emma, didn't acknowledge her presence, didn't offer even a perfunctory apology. And yet, despite being clearly excluded, Emma remained where she stood, not blocking anyone's way, not drawing attention to herself, just present. And for a long, uncomfortable moment, she was the only thing in that picture-perfect scene that didn't fit. A single muted brushstroke on a canvas of curated color. The driver, a tired-looking man in his 50s with a kind face and a salt and pepper beard, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He looked at Jessica, then at Emma, then back at his dashboard as if trying to calculate how much trouble he might get into for saying something. But he said nothing. Jessica gave him a short nod, and that was his signal. The bus door hissed shut, the hydraulic lift engaged, the tires groaned softly against the gravel, and the sleek vehicle pulled out onto the narrow country road, leaving Emma alone on the curb, her canvas bag still slung over one shoulder, the old travel guide resting against her hip like a silent witness. As the bus disappeared around a bend, the morning quiet settled again. Emma exhaled, long and slow, and for a brief moment she tilted her face toward the sun, letting the warmth erase the sting that lingered beneath her skin. Then she turned and walked slowly to a nearby wooden bench shaded by a jacaranda tree, where she sat and took out the travel guide. Flipping to a page near the back, she began making small handwritten notes in the margin. The vineyard they were headed to, Shepherd's Glen, was one she knew intimately, though she had never visited as a guest. She had read everything about it, studied its soil composition, its generational ownership, its recovery after the fires 6 years ago. Her handwriting was small, steady, focused. This wasn't anger, it wasn't pride, it was observation. She was studying the experience as if from the outside, like an anthropologist cataloging an event. 15 minutes passed before a young woman in a blue shirt with a vineyard logo approached, carrying a cup of herbal tea and a hesitant smile. "Are you Emma?" she asked, clearly nervous. Emma looked up and nodded. "I'm really sorry about the mix-up," the woman said. "I got your message a little late. We had a few issues with scheduling this morning. Your driver will be here soon. He's just finishing up another tour." Emma thanked her quietly, accepted the tea, and resumed her note-taking without any visible sign of irritation. The staffer hovered for a moment, unsure whether to leave, then finally did. And when the staffer was out of sight, Emma closed the guidebook and sat with her hands resting gently in her lap. The cup of tea steamed lightly in the morning air, and a soft breeze rustled the jacaranda leaves above her. Around her, the quiet resumed. She had been humiliated in the softest, most polished way possible, and yet somehow that made the dismissal even more cutting. No one had shouted. No one had been overtly rude, and yet it had been made perfectly clear she did not belong. Or so they believed. Emma had expected it in part. She knew how people read appearances, how quickly assumptions formed around shoes and fabric, posture and tone. What she had not expected was how swiftly everyone else had accepted that narrative without question. There had been no doubt, no pause. The guide hadn't even considered double-checking the roster. The tourist had fallen into an easy, reflexive alignment of us and other. She wasn't angry. She was documenting, cataloging, and even in that quiet, lonely moment under the tree, there was something dignified in how she held herself, as though she understood something about the situation that no one else yet did, something that would change the direction of the story entirely. The road to Shepherd's Glen wound gently through the hills, bordered on both sides by orderly rows of grapevines that glistened faintly with dew. By the time the sleek white and blue tour bus pulled into the gravel driveway of the vineyard's Welcome Center, the tourists inside were in high spirits, passing around small bags of biscotti and laughing at a shared joke about Jessica's exaggerated imitation of a French wine steward. The bus door opened with a hiss and Jessica descended first, clipboard in hand, moving with the casual confidence of someone used to being the face of luxury. She was already halfway through her practiced welcome speech before the rest of the group had fully stepped onto the gravel. The owners of Shepherd's Glen were waiting near a shaded pergola, where glasses of chilled rosé sparkled on a tray like pink jewels in the sun. It was the first official stop of the day, the beginning of what was promised to be a carefully curated journey through the heart of heritage wine culture. Jessica gestured grandly toward the hosts, guiding her group into place, adjusting the angles of their lines subtly so the photographer from the vineyard could get a clean promotional shot. Happy, older travelers with money, culture, and taste, standing among the vines like a brochure come to life. They were mid-toast when a sleek, dark gray hybrid vehicle rolled silently into the gravel lot. No one paid it much attention at first. The group was engaged in their wine tasting, and the vineyard staff were focused on the reception. It wasn't until the car parked beneath a flowering olive tree and a figure stepped out that people began to glance over. Emma emerged quietly, the same linen dress now slightly dusted from the morning bench, her canvas bag across her body, and a light scarf wrapped loosely around her shoulders to shield from the rising sun. She didn't look disheveled. She looked intentional, as though her appearance had been composed not for show but for function, a kind of elegant restraint. She didn't approach the group or interrupt the proceedings. Instead, she walked with calm precision around the edge of the property, passing a row of cypress and pausing near the old stone well at the center of the original homestead. One of the tourists noticed her and nudged his companion. "It's that girl from the hotel," he murmured, not bothering to lower his voice. "The one who tried to get on the bus." A few others turned. The elderly woman with the straw sun hat frowned, visibly unsettled by the presence of someone uninvited. Jessica turned too and stiffened. For a second, something flickered across her face. Annoyance or perhaps discomfort. But it was gone as quickly as it came. She stepped away from the group, leaving the guests with the vineyard assistant, and made her way toward Emma. "Excuse me," Jessica said, her voice pitched just above polite. "This is a private tour, ma'am. I really need to ask you not to follow us from stop to stop. It makes the other guests uncomfortable." Her smile was taut, her eyes sharp. Emma turned to her slowly, expression serene but firm. "I didn't follow you," she replied softly. "I have my own schedule. This property has public grounds." Jessica didn't answer immediately. She seemed uncertain for the first time, unsure whether she had the authority to press further. But pride is a powerful thing, and she recovered quickly, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear and straightening her shoulders. "Well," she said, "we've had issues in the past with people, misunderstanding the nature of these events. I just want to be sure there's no disruption." Emma inclined her head slightly in acknowledgement, not conceding but not provoking either. "Of course," she said. "I'm just enjoying the vineyard." The exchange ended there, but its tension lingered. As Jessica walked back to her group, the tourists fell silent for a moment. One of them, an older man in a cream-colored blazer, spoke up. "You know," he said to Jessica, "she seems perfectly respectful. I don't think she's doing any harm." Jessica forced a laugh. "Of course not. I just like to stay ahead of any confusion." But the dynamic had shifted. For the rest of the visit, Emma's presence hovered at the edge of their consciousness. At the second tasting table set under a vine-covered trellis with views of the valley, she was visible in the distance, seated on a low stone wall with a notebook in her lap. Her posture was relaxed but upright, her attention focused on the vineyard layout before her. Every now and then, she would glance up and sketch something quickly, then return to writing. She never once looked at the group again, and yet several of them kept looking at her. The woman in the silk scarf whispered to the man beside her. "She has the air of someone who belongs here, somehow, but no one knows who she is." Her voice held a note of discomfort, as if unsure whether to be dismissive or admiring. Jessica ignored the comment, pouring wine with more flourish than necessary, as if to reclaim the attention that had drifted. By the time they returned to the bus, the sun was higher, and the mood more subdued. The group boarded quietly, and several glanced out the window as the vehicle began to roll away. Emma hadn't moved. She was still by the stone wall, scribbling notes, the breeze lifting the edge of her scarf. Then the unexpected happened. As the bus pulled onto the narrow exit path, it paused to allow a supply truck to pass. From that vantage point, the entire group saw a woman in her 60s approach Emma, hug her warmly, and hand her a folder. They exchanged a few words, then laughed together. A moment later, the older woman, recognized by some as the vineyard's co-founder, gestured toward the vines as if deferring to Emma's opinion. The bus rolled forward again, but the image had been imprinted on all who saw it. The young woman they had dismissed now revealed ever so slightly to be something more. No explanations had been offered. None were needed yet. But the silence in the bus felt heavier now, the kind of silence that follows the slow unraveling of assumptions once held too tightly. The afternoon sun had shifted, casting longer shadows across the valley as the tour bus arrived at its second stop, an estate that prided itself on merging modern sustainability with historical roots. Rows of heirloom varietals stretched toward the hills, and a carefully restored barn stood in the distance, repurposed into a tasting room with floor-to-ceiling windows. The group disembarked a little more quietly this time, the earlier energy dimmed by the growing weight of something unspoken, No one mentioned the moment they had witnessed back at Shepherd's Glen. The older woman greeting Emma with unmistakable warmth, the way she had listened to her as if consulting an expert. But it lingered. People looked at Jessica now with slightly more hesitation, with subtle glances that seemed to search her face for signs of certainty they no longer entirely trusted. Jessica herself moved with the same trained poise, but there was a tension in her smile, a slight rush in her tone, a brittle edge to her words that hadn't been there in the morning. She knew the group had seen something. She just didn't yet understand what it meant. Inside the barn, the group was seated around a polished wood table adorned with trays of regional cheeses and fruit, their glasses filled with a rare white blend exclusive to the estate. The host, a third-generation vintner named Daniel, welcomed them with the ease of someone used to charming guests, but even his charisma couldn't fully cut through the strange undercurrent. Halfway through his introduction, a commotion by the front entrance drew every eye. Emma had entered the barn. She wasn't escorted, she didn't interrupt. She merely stepped inside quietly, removed her scarf, and walked along the outer edge of the room, observing a series of framed photographs on the walls. Portraits of the land from decades ago, black and white images of vineyard workers, snapshots of the early harvest seasons. She moved slowly, respectfully, and didn't so much as glance toward the table. Jessica stood up immediately, her voice low but sharp. "I'm sorry, this is a closed session," she said, walking quickly toward her. "I'm going to have to ask you to wait outside." Again. Her words carried the tension of someone no longer confident in the authority they were used to wielding. But before Emma could respond, Daniel, still smiling, intervened gently. "She's fine," he said, nodding toward Emma. "She's a colleague of our family. She's welcome here any time." The room went quiet. Jessica froze, her mouth slightly open, caught between the urge to reclaim control and the dawning awareness that it might be slipping through her fingers. Emma gave a small nod of thanks and turned back to the photographs, continuing her quiet inspection as though nothing had happened. The tourists, still holding their wine glasses midair, looked at each other with subtle shifts in posture and expression. The man in the cream blazer leaned toward the elderly widow and whispered, "I think we've all been wrong about her." The woman didn't respond, but her eyes didn't leave Emma, and when she finally took another sip of her wine, it was slower, more thoughtful, as though the drink had suddenly taken on a different meaning. As the tasting resumed, Emma eventually stepped out onto the veranda overlooking the fields, finding a bench in the shade where she could write again, the notebook open across her knees, her pen moving steadily. This time, however, one of the guests followed. It was the widow, Margaret, with her silk scarf now slightly loosened, and a different look in her eyes than the one she'd had on the bus that morning. She approached Emma without hesitation, not as a tourist engaging a stranger, but as a woman who recognized in another something she respected. "I hope you don't mind," Margaret said gently. "I thought the view might be better from here." Emma looked up and smiled, a real smile, not the quiet, closed-lipped kind she had worn all day. "It is," she said softly. "It always is when you're a little apart from the crowd." Margaret sat beside her, the two of them staring out at the vineyard in companionable silence for a moment. Then she added, "When you tried to board this morning, I didn't say anything. I saw what happened, and I told myself it wasn't my place to interfere. I regret that now." Emma's gaze remained on the hills. "You don't need to apologize," she said. "It wasn't meant to be a scene." "But it became one anyway," Margaret replied, her voice heavier. "Not loud, not ugly, but something small and cold. And those things stay with us, even when we pretend they don't." Emma finally turned to look at her. "They do," she agreed. "But so does kindness." Margaret studied her for a moment, then nodded slowly. "You're not just a visitor," she said. "You know these lands. The way you look at them, it's not the way a tourist looks." Emma paused, then replied, "My family used to work these lands. My grandmother harvested grapes for 25 seasons not far from here. I grew up learning their names before I could spell my own." There was another silence, deeper now, shared, the kind that doesn't need to be filled, and when Margaret stood to leave, she rested her hand gently on Emma's shoulder. A gesture simple and full of weight. "Whatever you're doing," she said, "don't stop." By the time the tour moved on, Jessica's voice had lost some of its usual brightness. The guests boarded the bus with less chatter. Several glanced toward the edge of the property where Emma remained seated, watching the road stretch beyond the horizon. They had come for curated beauty, scheduled elegance, safe discovery. What they found instead was a quiet stranger whose silence said more than any guide's rehearsed monologue. Something was shifting, not only in how they saw her, but in how they began to see themselves. The third stop on the itinerary was supposed to be the highlight of the day. A historic estate perched on a hilltop, known not only for its limited release vintages, but for its architectural grandeur and private library housing. Rare wine manuscripts from the 18th century. The bus wound up the gravel road with a faint rattle, kicking dust into the hot afternoon air. The passengers inside were quieter now. Something had settled over them since the second vineyard. Something unspoken but persistent, like the aftertaste of a tannic red wine. Jessica tried to revive the energy, pointing out facts from her laminated note cards, but the reactions were delayed, polite rather than eager. The laughter had thinned. Even her familiar jokes landed with the dullness of over-rehearsal. She sensed it too, though she pretended not to. They disembarked beneath a wide stone archway, welcomed by uniformed staff who offered chilled towels and a sweet herbal cordial. The group murmured their thanks and began drifting toward the ornate tasting salon. Jessica remained near the entrance, speaking to the estate's coordinator, while the guests admired the gleaming wooden floors and arched stained glass windows that filtered golden light onto rows of polished decanters. Then, from the side path, another car appeared. Not the same gray hybrid from before, but a sleek black vehicle with tinted windows that parked silently near the administrative wing. No one thought much of it until the door opened, and a man in a well-fitted dark blue blazer stepped out, followed by a woman in a silk blouse carrying a slim leather case. They spoke briefly to a staff member who nodded and led them inside. Jessica caught sight of them and stiffened, her eyes narrowing. Something about their composure, their purposeful gait, the way the woman held that leather case with both confidence and deference, it all unsettled her. A few guests noticed too, exchanging glances. Moments later, Emma arrived. Not through the public entryway, but from a side terrace, her linen dress now gently pressed, her hair gathered more deliberately, her posture still serene but unmistakably poised. She didn't look like a guest anymore. She looked like someone expected. As the group moved into the salon for the private lecture on the estate's history, the estate director, a dignified man in his 60s with a soft European accent, stepped up to the front and began with warm, practiced gratitude for their visit. But midway through his welcome, he paused and glanced toward the hallway. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, adjusting his glasses, "I've just been informed that one of our partners is present today, and I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge her." Every head turned. The director smiled toward Emma, who had stepped inside quietly. "Ms. Brooks is among the founding members of the Heritage Viticultural Trust. Several of our restoration projects were made possible by her involvement and vision. Emma, would you like to say a few words?" Jessica turned pale. The group froze. Emma looked briefly toward the window, as if weighing the invitation, then nodded. She stepped forward, not dramatically, not seeking attention, but with the quiet, effortless grace of someone who had nothing to prove. "Thank you," she said simply. "I won't speak long. I just want to say that places like this are alive, not because of their beauty, but because of the hands that have touched them over time. Hands that are often forgotten. I come here not as an owner or a patron, but as someone whose family once stood in these fields, barefoot in the heat, harvesting what others would taste years later. Their names are not on plaques, but their stories are in the soil. I remember them. And I hope, after today, you will too." Silence followed, not awkward, but reverent. Emma gave a small nod, stepped back, and returned to the edge of the room. She did not look at Jessica. She didn't need to. The shift had already happened. The guests, once skeptical or indifferent, now saw her through a completely different lens. One that reframed every earlier moment not as ambiguous, but as humiliating in hindsight. And perhaps more painfully, they saw themselves too. How easily they had accepted a narrative offered to them without ever asking who she truly was. Later, during the library tour, as the group wandered among glass cases filled with antique books, Jessica stood to the side trying to collect herself. The estate's director was now deep in conversation with Emma, the two of them speaking about the trust, referencing shared colleagues, legacy funding models, soil conservation. It was a different language, and it was clear Emma spoke it fluently. Margaret, the widow, lingered near them and was eventually invited into the conversation. Emma greeted her warmly, introducing her by name and thanking her for a kindness when it mattered. Margaret flushed but smiled with the quiet pride of someone who had chosen the right side of history. As the sun began to lower and the golden light thickened into amber, the group returned to the bus. No one spoke as they boarded. The silence was no longer one of judgment or confusion, but of reflection, the kind that settles in when people realize they've missed something important and have no idea how to make it right. Jessica climbed aboard last, her clipboard now clutched loosely in one hand. She glanced toward Emma, who was still outside speaking to one of the Foundation representatives. Jessica hesitated, then walked to her usual place at the front and picked up the microphone. She began her closing remarks, but her voice trembled slightly and she paused. She looked down, exhaled, then raised her eyes again. "I know today has been a little different from what we planned," she said, her tone softer than it had been all day. "And I know we've all had moments we'll probably look back on with new eyes." Her gaze flicked toward the window where Emma now stood alone, facing the valley. Jessica didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. The bus pulled away slowly, and in the rearview mirror, Emma grew smaller and smaller, her figure still and upright against the vastness of the hillside. The kind of figure you remember, not because she demands attention, but because she commands respect without asking. And by now, everyone on that bus understood that. Evening had settled softly over the hills by the time the bus returned to the central square of the valley town, where the day's journey had begun. The sunlight had lost its sharpness, replaced by a warm, diffused glow that bathed the tiled rooftops and stone facades in gentle amber. The group of tourists filed out slowly, no longer energized by the novelty of the tour, but quieter, more introspective. The earlier liveliness had dulled into a contemplative hush, the kind that followed not boredom but a subtle reckoning. There were no selfies at the bus door this time, no laughter echoing off the cobblestone. Jessica stood to the side of the vehicle, her clipboard lowered, her voice soft as she thanked the guests one by one, though even she could sense the change in their tone. The same people who had once hung on her explanations now offered her only brief nods, polite but distant, their attention elsewhere. The square had been transformed during their absence. A low stage had been set at one end, framed with climbing wisteria and fairy lights strung between lampposts. Tables were arranged in a half circle, each covered with simple white linens and small centerpieces made of lavender, rosemary, and vineyard stones. It was a gathering arranged for something more meaningful than tourism, a celebration perhaps, or a statement. A woman from the town's council welcomed them gently, inviting everyone to take a seat. No names were announced, no fanfare. Everything was quiet, elegant, unforced. The guests, unsure but curious, followed the motion of the evening like leaves caught in a stream. Then Emma appeared, not from behind the stage, but walking down the central path, as if simply returning from a walk. Her linen dress had been replaced by a deep blue wrap that caught the fading sunlight like silk water, and a simple silver pendant rested just above her collarbone. Her hair was no longer tucked away but fell in loose waves, touched slightly by the breeze. She moved with the same composure as before, but now there was no mistaking the shift. People didn't glance past her anymore. They looked at her directly, and they waited. The woman from the council smiled and stepped aside, and Emma took the stage, not elevated by height, but by presence. She didn't need a microphone. Her voice, clear and low, carried across the square, not by force, but through stillness. "I wasn't meant to speak tonight," she began. "This was originally a closed meeting, but something changed today, and I believe when things change in the open, they should be addressed in the open." She paused, letting the words settle. "Some of you know me now. Most of you didn't this morning, and that's not your fault. We make assumptions, all of us, based on clothing, posture, tone. I've done it too. But today reminded me why I do the work I do, why I helped build this foundation, why I walk the tours anonymously before I ever sign a check or put my name on a plaque." She looked out over the tables. It's because how we treat people when we think they are no one is exactly who we are. The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was cleansing. She didn't cry. She didn't blame. There was no pointed glance at Jessica, no call for apology, no demand for reversal. She simply stood there, elegant and still, and allowed the moment to reveal what needed to be revealed. And it did. In the stillness, the tourists looked not at Emma, but at one another, and, more piercingly, inward. Emma stepped down without another word, walking toward the back of the courtyard where the vineyard families and staff were seated, shaking hands, sharing quiet greetings. A few guests began to clap, then others followed. Not the forced applause of a staged event, but the slow, rising sound of understanding finding its voice. The kind that didn't celebrate her wealth or her influence, but her restraint. Her dignity, her refusal to humiliate those who had so easily dismissed her. It was not a moment of triumph, it was something deeper. It was grace, made visible, and from that moment on she would not be forgotten, not for who she was, but for how she chose to reveal it. The next morning arrived quietly, the sky painted in soft layers of gray and rose, the valley waking slowly under a light mist that hovered above the vines like a memory that refused to lift too quickly. The square was nearly empty, save for a few local vendors setting up stalls and sweeping their doorsteps. A new tour group would be gathering soon, their buses already lined up along the curb, engines idling gently, unaware of the story that had unfolded here just a day before. Inside the small office of Golden Trails, Jessica sat at her desk, her usual posture now slightly slouched, her expression unreadable as she stared at a printed sheet of names. She had read it 3 times and still hadn't absorbed the meaning fully. Not because it wasn't clear, but because it was. At the top of the page, under the newly announced leadership team, was the name she had avoided thinking about since last night. Emma Brooks, listed not as a guest advisor or silent investor, but as managing partner of the restructured regional branch. No title was flashy. No explanation followed. Just a line beneath it that read, "All tours will operate under revised ethical and inclusion standards beginning this season." Jessica folded the paper carefully, placed it in a drawer, and sat in silence for several minutes, before slowly rising and moving toward the window. Outside, a new guide, a younger man in a simple black polo, was welcoming a group with calm professionalism. He was handing out reusable water bottles, not branded souvenirs. One of the guests asked about the notebook Emma had used, now on display in the Welcome Center's glass case, open to a page where she'd written in neat cursive, "Observation, patience, and stillness often reveal more than any schedule can." Down the Hascomimemis street, Emma was sitting on a bench beneath the jacaranda tree where she had waited alone just yesterday. She wasn't reading this time. She was simply watching the town wake up, her legs crossed, a coffee cup resting lightly in her hands. She looked neither triumphant nor self-satisfied, just calm, present, whole. A woman passed by with her granddaughter, paused, then turned back. "Miss Brooks?" she asked hesitantly. "From the story?" Emma looked up and smiled. "That's me." The woman nodded, eyes warm. "I told my granddaughter that kindness isn't weakness. You reminded us of that." Emma's smile deepened. Then the day wasn't wasted. As the child waved and they continued on their way, Emma turned her gaze back toward the hills. The buses were rolling out again, filled with new faces, new assumptions, new beginnings. And somewhere, just faintly, a new kind of journey had begun, not marked by schedules or reservations, but by awareness, the kind that didn't need a guide to follow, the kind that would stay long after the engine quieted.